Victorian London was a city defined by an unbreakable divide between the glittering aristocracy and the invisible servants working in their shadows. It was a society where obedience was absolute. Against this backdrop of immense wealth and silent desperation, an unprecedented crowd gathered outside a grim prison. They had not come to witness the execution of a fallen monarch or a notorious crime boss. They were there to watch a simple valet hang. This is the story of a brutal murder that terrified high society, proving the deadliest enemy often lives beneath your own roof. To understand how a single murder could captivate nations and terrify the highest echelons of society, we must step back to the early morning hours of May 6, 1840. The location was number 14 Norfolk Street, nestled in the highly exclusive and fiercely guarded neighbourhood of Park Lane, London. In this era, Park Lane was an absolute fortress of aristocratic privilege, lined with towering, opulent mansions that housed Britain's most elite families. It was a sanctuary of wealth, where violent crime was something merely read about in the gritty newspapers, completely detached from their polished reality. But on this particular Wednesday morning, the pristine and secure quiet of the neighbourhood was about to be shattered in the most unimaginable way. The day began like any other for the household staff, long before the wealthy masters upstairs even began to stir in their beds. Housemaid Sarah Manser was the first to rise, tasked with the heavy labour of preparing the home for the day ahead. As she made her way through the dimly lit, labyrinthine corridors of the servants' quarters to begin her morning chores, an unsettling draft caught her attention. Stepping into the lower levels of the house, Sarah noticed that the heavy wooden back door, which should have been securely bolted against the London night, was standing wide open. Panic began to set in as she moved into the adjacent dining and sitting rooms. Drawers had been aggressively pulled out, expensive cabinets were forced open, and valuable items were scattered haphazardly across the floor. The manor had clearly been ransacked. Terrified that a gang of ruthless intruders might still be lurking in the shadows, Sarah knew she had to immediately alert the master of the house. With her heart pounding violently in her chest, the young housemaid hurried up the grand, sweeping staircase to the master bedroom. She approached the door of Lord William Russell, a 73-year-old prominent British politician, a member of Parliament, and a deeply respected figure within the aristocracy. Knocking softly and receiving no answer, she tentatively pushed the heavy oak door open. The sight that awaited her in the pale morning light was one of absolute, paralyzing horror. Lord Russell lay motionless on his bed, the luxurious white sheets now soaked in a deep, expanding pool of dark crimson. His throat had been slashed with such savage, unrestrained brutality that the wound had nearly severed his head from his body. There were no obvious signs of a defensive struggle, suggesting the elderly lord had been ambushed and murdered in his sleep, completely unaware of the violent end that had come for him in his own private sanctuary. Sarah's piercing screams echoed through the cavernous halls of the manor, quickly drawing the panicked attention of the remaining staff. Among the first to rush to the scene was François Benjamin Courvoisier, a 23-year-old Swiss immigrant who had recently been hired as Lord Russell's personal valet. In the Victorian hierarchy, the valet was the most intimate of servants, responsible for dressing, shaving, and directly attending to the master's personal needs. Courvoisier had only been working at the Norfolk Street residence for 5 short weeks, having secured what many would consider the highly coveted position of serving a top-tier aristocrat. As he rushed into the blood-soaked bedroom and saw the mutilated body of his employer, Courvoisier appeared entirely consumed by shock. He threw his hands to his face, wailing and pacing the room in a state of hysterical panic, visibly devastated by the horrifying violation of their supposedly secure home. To the terrified servants and the first responding local constables, the narrative seemed chillingly clear. A ruthless band of thieves had broken into a wealthy Park Lane mansion in the dead of night, slaughtering an elderly aristocrat when he perhaps woke up and surprised them during their plundering. It was the ultimate Victorian nightmare come to life, a stark reminder that even the highest walls could not keep the criminal underbelly at bay. But when the seasoned, meticulous detectives of the newly formed Metropolitan Police, famously known as Scotland Yard, arrived to examine the bloody scene, the pieces of this violent puzzle vehemently refused to fit together. Everything looked exactly like a burglary gone terribly, tragically wrong. However, as investigators began to look closer at the shattered locks and the scattered silver, they realized this supposed thief had just made a fatal amateur mistake. When the newly formed Metropolitan Police, the early iteration of the legendary Scotland Yard, began their meticulous examination of 14 Norfolk Street, their first priority was the point of entry. The heavy wooden back door, found wide open by the terrified housemaid, was the obvious starting point for a supposedly violent home invasion. However, as the seasoned investigators crouched down to examine the splintered wood and the gouge marks around the heavy iron lock, a glaring inconsistency emerged. The brutal force used to pry the door open had not been applied from the dark London streets outside. The leverage marks clearly indicated that the door had been aggressively pried open from the inside. The intruder hadn't broken into the grand manner. Someone had broken out of it, or rather, desperately wanted it to look that way. This immediate physical evidence completely fractured the narrative of a random, opportunistic burglary, leading the detectives to scrutinize the rest of the ransacked ground floor with renewed suspicion. Expensive silver heirlooms and valuable trinkets were conspicuously missing from the violently pulled drawers and forced cabinets, exactly what one would expect a gang of thieves to target. Yet, May in London was notoriously damp, and the streets outside Park Lane were thick with mud and horse-drawn carriage debris. If a band of common criminals had slipped into the house, murdered a lord, and carried out heavy bags of silver, they would have inevitably tracked dirt, blood, and chaos across the pristine floors. Instead, the carpets remained immaculate. There were no muddy footprints leading toward the back door, nor were there any fading tracks escaping into the night. The grim realization settled over the investigators. The killer had never actually left the house. Knowing the murderer was almost certainly someone who slept under Lord Russell's roof. The police immediately shifted their focus from the grand upper floors to the shadowy, cramped domain of the servants below stairs. They began a systematic and relentless search of the staff quarters, tearing through the meager personal belongings of the cooks, maids, and footmen. The breakthrough occurred when they reached the small, dimly lit pantry, assigned specifically to François Benjamin Courvoisier, the distraught young valet. As officers scrutinized every inch of his private workspace, they noticed something slightly amiss with the wooden skirting boards lining the base of the walls. Prying the seemingly secure wooden panels away from the plaster, the investigators uncovered a cleverly concealed, hollow space. Hidden deep within this makeshift cavity lay the very silver items that had supposedly been carried off by the phantom intruders just hours before. The discovery was the definitive piece of the puzzle that shattered the valet's fragile alibi. The stolen wealth of Lord Russell had never even made it out of the house, rendering the entire chaotic scene upstairs nothing more than a desperate, poorly executed theatrical performance. Courvoisier, who just hours earlier had been pacing the master bedroom in a state of theatrical grief and hysterical shock, was immediately confronted with the damning evidence pulled from his own pantry walls. Stripped of his elaborate facade, the 23-year-old Swiss immigrant was formally placed under arrest by Scotland Yard for the brutal, cold-blooded murder of his aristocratic employer. On the surface, the crime appeared solved, neatly wrapped up as a tragic case of a greedy servant stealing from his wealthy master. But as investigators began to dig into the background of François Benjamin Courvoisier, a baffling contradiction arose. Why would a relatively well-paid valet, holding a highly coveted position and living in the absolute lap of Victorian luxury, throw his life away and face the hangman's noose for a few pieces of easily traceable silver? The true motive behind the slaughter of Lord Russell had nothing to do with mere theft, and the dark reality of what actually triggered the violence was far more sinister than anyone could have predicted. To comprehend the brutal events of that May morning, one must first understand the suffocating social architecture of 1840s Britain. The Victorian manor was not merely a residence. It was a rigidly stratified microcosm of society. Above ground, in the sunlit, opulent drawing rooms, the aristocracy glided through a world of unimaginable privilege. Below, the stairs, confined to dark, subterranean kitchens and cramped pantries, existed a silent army of domestic workers. This invisible workforce was expected to move like ghosts, anticipating every need of their masters while remaining entirely unseen and unheard. The divide between these two worlds was absolute, separated not just by wooden floorboards, but by an impenetrable barrier of bloodline and birthright. For an immigrant valet like Courvoisier, retaining a position in a house like 14 Norfolk Street was the absolute pinnacle of an otherwise precarious existence. The fragile equilibrium of Lord Russell's household irrevocably shattered on the evening of Tuesday, May 5th. While attending to his regular duties, Courvoisier made a fatal miscalculation. Lord Russell, known for his sharp eye and strict aristocratic demeanor, unexpectedly caught his new valet in the act of pilfering minor valuables from the estate. In the grand scheme of the immense wealth surrounding them, the theft was negligible, but in the rigid moral hierarchy of the era, it was an unforgivable betrayal of trust. The elderly politician did not immediately summon the constables to drag the young Swiss man away in chains. Instead, he delivered a punishment that, in the context of the 19th century, was infinitely more devastating. Lord Russell coldly informed Courvoisier that he would be summarily dismissed first thing the following morning, and crucially, he would be cast out without a character reference to the modern ear. Losing a letter of recommendation might sound like a mere professional setback, but in the unforgiving economy of Victorian England, a character reference was the singular currency of survival. Servants owned nothing but their reputation. If a valet was discharged from a prominent household without a written endorsement of his honesty, sobriety, and moral standing, he became instantly unemployable. The whispering network of high society would ensure that no respectable family would ever open their doors to him again. For Courvoisier, Lord Russell's decree was not just a termination of employment, it was a guaranteed death sentence. Without wages or a place to sleep, the 23-year-old would be swiftly swallowed by the merciless London slums, destined for starvation, vagrancy, or the horrific, punishing confines of a Victorian workhouse. Facing this terrifying abyss, the psychology of the crime shifts dramatically from one of calculated greed to one of blind, primal desperation. Courvoisier was not a hardened criminal masterminding a lucrative heist to build his fortune. He was a panicked, terrified young man who had suddenly found himself backed into a corner with absolutely no means of escape. The stolen silver, hidden behind the pantry skirting boards, was never the true motive for the murder, but rather a clumsy, frantic attempt to create a smokescreen after the fact. As midnight approached and the grand house plunged into heavy darkness, Courvoisier realized that as long as Lord William Russell drew breath to ruin his name, his own life was effectively over. In the suffocating silence of the manor, the primal instinct for survival violently overrode morality, leading a desperate servant to quietly ascend the grand staircase with a blade in hand. The sombre, wood-panelled halls of London's Central Criminal Court, famously known as the Old Bailey, served as the grand, suffocating theatre for the final act of this aristocratic tragedy. By June 1840, the trial of François Benjamin Courvoisier had become the absolute epicenter of public obsession. Wealthy elites packed the viewing galleries, eager to see the rogue servant who had violated the sacred boundaries of their world. Standing in the heavily guarded dock, the young Swiss valet faced the terrifying prospect of the gallows. However, he was not entirely defenseless against the immense, crushing weight of the British justice system. Courvoisier was represented by Charles Phillips, one of the most prominent, theatrical, and highly skilled defense attorneys of the Victorian era. Phillips built a fierce, aggressive initial defense, systematically challenging the prosecution's circumstantial evidence and pointing out every minor inconsistency in the police timeline. For a brief, agonizing moment, it seemed entirely possible that this silver-tongued lawyer might actually save the desperate servant from the hangman's noose. But midway through these highly publicized proceedings, a devastating twist completely derailed the defense's carefully constructed strategy. Scotland Yard detectives had tirelessly continued their background investigation and suddenly produced a brand new, irrefutable piece of physical evidence. They had successfully tracked down a missing parcel containing several highly identifiable, engraved pieces of Lord Russell's silver. Crucially, multiple witnesses positively identified Courvoisier, proving that he had personally left this heavy parcel at a French hotel in Leicester Square just days before his dramatic arrest. When this damning information was presented before the judge and jury, the color completely drained from the young valet's face. The fragile, elaborate wall of lies he had constructed was instantly obliterated. Looking at the undeniable proof of his guilt sitting on the evidence table, Courvoisier knew with absolute certainty that he was a doomed man. What happened next in the shadowy corridors of the court would ignite one of the most explosive legal scandals in British history. During a tense, highly charged recess in the trial, a panicked Courvoisier leaned over the rail of the dock and whispered a desperate secret confession directly into the ear of his lawyer. He admitted, without hesitation, that he had indeed brutally slit Lord Russell's throat in the dead of night. However, in the very same breath, the cold-blooded valet explicitly demanded that Charles Phillips continue to defend him and fight tooth and nail to save his life. Armed with the undeniable, first-hand knowledge that his client was a ruthless murderer, Phillips was faced with an impossible professional dilemma. He made a highly controversial and morally reprehensible decision. Returning to the courtroom, the attorney did not step down, nor did he temper his aggressive tactics. Instead, Phillips launched a vicious, calculated attack on the most vulnerable target available: the innocent housemaid, Sarah Manser. With ruthless courtroom theatricality, Phillips mercilessly cross-examined the terrified young woman, weaponizing her own trauma against her. He heavily implied to the jury that she, along with the other domestic staff, were the true masterminds behind the bloody conspiracy. He was deliberately trying to send an innocent working-class girl to the gallows simply to fulfill his duty to a confessed killer. Fortunately for Sarah Manser, the jury saw right through the attorney's malicious smoke and mirrors. It took them barely over an hour to deliberate and return a unanimous verdict of guilty. Courvoisier was formally sentenced to be hanged by the neck until dead. Yet, the true, lasting shockwave of this trial hit long after the executioner's trapdoor fell. When the public and the press eventually discovered that Charles Phillips had actively tried to frame an innocent woman while secretly knowing his client was the murderer, it triggered an absolute uproar. This horrifying revelation sparked a massive, historic debate across the legal world regarding the ethical boundaries of a defense attorney, a fierce, ongoing debate about the dangerous line between a lawyer's duty to their client and their duty to the truth. In an era before transatlantic telegraph cables could transmit information in seconds, news traveled at the creeping pace of steamships and packet boats. Yet, when the sensational details of the Park Lane murder finally washed ashore in the bustling ports of New York and Boston in the summer of 1840, the story exploded with the force of a modern viral phenomenon. The brutal slaying of Lord William Russell did not remain a localized London tragedy. It rapidly morphed into an international obsession, capturing the imaginations of readers thousands of miles away who had never even set foot on British soil. For the American press, this gruesome event was much more than just a shocking true crime story to sell penny papers. Editors across the United States seized upon the Courvoisier case, wielding it as a powerful, ideological weapon. For a young American republic that had fought bitterly to sever its ties with the British Crown, the murder served as the ultimate cautionary tale. The newspapers did not merely report the facts of the trial. They framed the tragedy as undeniable proof of the deep-seated rot, moral decay, and inherent corruption festering beneath the glittering facade of the British aristocracy. To the American media, the violent snapping of a desperate valet was not an isolated incident, but the inevitable, bloody consequence of an unnatural society built upon extreme inequality and oppressive class divides. Yet, beneath this righteous journalistic grandstanding lay a complex psychological paradox that continues to define the American audience today. Then, as now, there existed a profound, romanticized fascination in the United States with the English manor house, an idealized vision of sprawling estates, impeccable manners, and a flawless, unspoken social order. The American public hungrily devoured every gruesome detail of the Courvoisier case precisely because it violently shattered that pristine illusion. Readers were absolutely captivated by the revelation of the dark, claustrophobic reality hidden behind the velvet curtains and heavy mahogany doors of London's elite. The story exposed the suffocating, unspoken tension of living intimately with an invisible, impoverished underclass turning the idealized image of the British aristocratic estate into a gilded cage fueled by suspicion, resentment, and quiet desperation. Meanwhile, back in the wealthy enclaves of London, the psychological fallout from the trial was manifesting in profoundly physical ways. A genuine, creeping paranoia descended upon the sprawling mansions of Mayfair and Belgravia. The unspoken social contract, the blind trust that the aristocracy placed in the invisible hands that fed them, dressed them, and shaved them, had been irrevocably broken. Suddenly, the silent, obedient servants who moved like ghosts through the subterranean corridors were viewed with a deep, existential dread. The Courvoisier case had successfully fundamentally altered the daily habits of the British elite. For the first time in recent history, wealthy families began a new, chilling nightly ritual, aggressively throwing the heavy iron bolts and locking their thick oak bedroom doors from the inside before going to sleep. The murder had installed a permanent, lingering terror in the hearts of the upper class, the horrifying realization that the deadliest threat they faced was not lurking out on the dangerous, fog-choked streets of London. Instead, the true danger was the enemy below stairs, quietly waiting in the shadows of their very own homes. Which brings our narrative full circle, returning to the very scene where this dark tale began. On the morning of July 6, 1840, a staggering 40,000 people descended upon the grim, imposing stone facade of Newgate Prison. They had gathered to watch François Benjamin Courvoisier take his final agonizing breaths upon the gallows. Yet, not everyone in that massive, roaring crowd was caught up in the bloodlust of the public spectacle. Standing quietly among the masses was the legendary British author William Makepeace Thackeray. Deeply disturbed and physically nauseated by the sheer barbarity of the festive atmosphere surrounding a man's brutal demise, Thackeray was moved to pen his profoundly influential essay, Going to See a Man Hanged. His passionate words served as a scathing condemnation of public executions, capturing the grotesque reality of a supposedly civilized society that treated state-sanctioned death as a morning's entertainment. Ultimately, the Courvoisier case stands as a multi-layered historical tragedy that extends far beyond a single bloody night inside a Park Lane mansion. It is the story of an elderly aristocratic lord who lost his life over the rigid, unforgiving enforcement of class boundaries. It is the tragic tale of a young, desperate immigrant who met his end on a rope because the paralyzing fear of absolute poverty and starvation drove him to the ultimate violence. Furthermore, it brutally exposed the rotting, hypocritical foundation of a justice system riddled with glaring inequities. A system where a renowned, wealthy defense attorney was perfectly willing to legally sacrifice an innocent, working-class housemaid just to protect a confessed killer. The murder in the manor violently ripped away the heavy velvet curtains of the Victorian era, forcing both Britain and the watching world to confront the deadly, inevitable consequences of immense wealth built upon silent suffering. I want to thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the dark heart of the 1840s. If you appreciate these thoroughly researched journeys into historical true crime, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast, leave a rating, and share this episode with your fellow history enthusiasts. Before I go, I want to pose a question to you all. What do you truly think about the actions of the defense lawyer Charles Phillips? Was he merely fulfilling his absolute legal duty to his client, or did his actions cross an unforgivable moral line? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I will see you again soon for another true crime episode.